Hello and welcome to a Wilson Center Polar Institute special event on the Arctic and U.S. national security. Hi, I'm your host, John Molesky, and my co-host for this event is Mike Sfraga. Mike is director of the Wilson Center's Global Risk and Resilience Program and also of the previously announced Polar Institute. Mike, welcome back. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, John.
Now, this is an exciting one. The Admiral who'll be speaking to us, and you'll tell the viewers more about him in a second.
Yeah.
It's made some news. I've been seeing lots of clippings about these comments.
It has made some news. So Admiral Paul Zukunft just retired, former Commandant of the Coast Guard. What's interesting about Admiral Zukunft is that he really prepared the Coast Guard, I think, well for this global perspective on the Arctic, and here's why. He was key and critical in creating the Arctic Coast Guard Forum. That's all Arctic nations working together, search and rescue, of course, tyranny of distance in the Arctic. So Admiral Zukunft has the background and the expertise to think forward about where the Coast Guard should go. Second, he's been just an adamant supporter of new icebreakers for the United States, and of course that's a major issue right now. Third is that I think he has prepared the ground well for our current Commandant to build upon, not just nationally for the United States, but internationally with our colleagues across the Arctic.
Great. I look forward to it. I did not get to see when he was here live, so let's all take a look at the comments from the Admiral.
So I called a while ago our friend and colleague, Admiral Zukunft, and I said, I know you're retired and enjoying Hawaii, but the Arctic needs you. And his response was, I'm in, what do you need? And I said, well, that's good. First, I need for you to come to D.C., and I'm happy to take your place in Hawaii. He said he'd come to D.C., but the Hawaii thing was kind of out of the question. But I did ask him to come here and speak with us today, not only this presentation, but also to participate in a lunch discussion with David Sanger, and then later on chair a panel. So we've asked a lot of Admiral Zukunft, but there's a reason why. It's because he's become a true champion of the Arctic, not just the U.S. Coast Guard, but Arctic communities and the larger circumpolar north. Let me just briefly highlight a few points about Admiral Zukunft, and then we'll come here and ask him to talk about the U.S. and the Arctic challenges and perspectives from his point of view, which I think weaves nicely with the themes we heard this morning. So affectionately known as Admiral Z, he served as the 25th Commandant of the Coast Guard from 2014 to 2018. During this period, he initiated a strategy-driven budget with the emphasis upon the Arctic, Western Hemisphere, cybersecurity, human resources, and the maritime transportation system, culminating in the largest appropriation in Coast Guard history to modernize its fleet, grow a more diverse workforce, and upgrade its aging infrastructure. Admiral Zukunft was instrumental in the formation and the execution of the Arctic Coast Guard Forum, a very tangible, practical demonstration of all 8 Arctic nations working together, including the Russian Federation. Admiral Zukunft continues to support this important work of the Arctic, and we very much appreciate him being here today. Please welcome to the podium the former Commandant of the United States Coast Guard, Admiral Paul Zukunft.
After that flattering introduction, Mike, I might just reopen that offer to come to Hawaii. Well, it's great to be here, and especially to those who are live streamed out there as well. And I meant earnestly, the best data is the data you get from listening. And that's why I'm here today, because I spent a good part of my Coast Guard career attuned to the issues that many of you have been exposed to here today on the Arctic. And then now that we have the issues before us, you're going to hear more today, what do we do with it? And so, one, the Arctic, as you have seen, is not static. But, from the outside looking in, I would say that we are strategically static. And that we've taken a pause on the Arctic, and in fact, we have literally papered the Arctic with policies and strategies, and those will be updated. But what are we doing to implement those strategies? And I'm going to leave it to the panel that we'll close out with here later today of what is the pathway, what is the way ahead for the Arctic. And so when we leave this event, and Mike, I want to thank you and the Wilson Center for pulling this together and the sponsors that made this possible. What tangible footsteps can we make going forward? And I'll tease out a few thoughts that I think are certainly within the realm of the possible. But first of all, I thought I'd just give you a quick rehash of where have we been in the Arctic. And so you go back to March 30th, 1867, as I vaguely recall, when Secretary of State William H. Seward acquires the Alaska Territory. And it was dubbed Seward's Folly. So fast forward 151 years, would we call that a folly today? But what would historians look back upon in 2018 as they see an opening ocean and people wringing their hands and fretting about it, but we do nothing about it? That, I would say, would be folly as well. Do we have strategies for the Arctic? Absolutely. We had the Ottawa Declaration, and out of the Ottawa Declaration came the Arctic Council, which has now been up and running. We had a great opportunity at the threshold when we had Canada and the United States as back-to-back chairs of the Arctic Council. And I thought if there's any time to have a one North America approach strategically for the Arctic, this would have been it. But we didn't quite get there. And then in the middle of our chairmanship, we had a change in administration, and it kind of let the air out of the balloon. And so the one thing we need to do is apply relentless pressure to the Arctic that can survive one political administration to the next. Now, there's a term that you'll hear about the Arctic, and it's called Arctic acceleration. I think many of you, and certainly the scientists in here, know what Arctic acceleration means, which means the climate is changing faster in the Arctic than it is anywhere else on the face of the Earth today. And there's a difference between climate and weather. But if you really want to get an appreciation for climate change, get your data from the first source. So a year and a half ago, I went with Angus King and two world-renowned climatologists, and we went out to the Jakobshavn Glacier in Greenland. It's spelled Jakobshavn if you're trying to find that or Google it. But it's the fastest moving glacier on the face of the Earth. And so we went out there, we met with the Inuit elders, and we said, so what are we looking at here? They said, well, if you were here 5 years ago, this glacier would have extended 25 miles further to the west. It's retreated 25 miles in 5 years. You could literally watch it move. Well, where's the water going? In fact, when we flew out there, we saw raging rivers of ice melt going down moulins, which are basically sinkholes, which lubricates the ice field and allows the ice to flow into the ocean. That is new water entering our oceans. The two climatologists that we had with us said, we can anticipate at least a 2-foot sea rise by the end of this century. And that's just coming off the ice fields of Greenland. It doesn't even factor in, well, what about Antarctica? So that all comes back to infrastructure. So then you look at the one slide you saw in David Kennedy's slide deck was out in Shishmaref. I was out there with Senator Sullivan just about a year ago. And we met with the elders there. In fact, they have literally voted themselves off the island. They're hoping that the Army Corps of Engineers can put enough revetment in there to prevent coastal erosion. But you start looking at climate, rising sea levels, but what you also have is sea ice retreats. You have that natural buffer, that breakwater no longer exists. And so you have villages like Shishmaref and over in 30 others in Alaska that are being threatened by coastal erosion. So we have this arisal of what I would call environmental refugees. We already have one in the United States. It's in Louisiana. It's the Ile de St. Charles, and they voted themselves off the island at great expense, by the way. As land subsidence and sea level came up, they had to evacuate. So that's what's at stake. So when we look at the Arctic, and you've heard a number of these, what is at stake in the Arctic today? And I'll just rattle off a few of these. The first is natural resources. Roughly 13% of the world's oil, about a third of the gas, roughly $1 trillion of minerals reside up on the seabed and below it up in the Arctic. As I said earlier, it's not economically feasible to harvest today, but certainly I would consider this a strategic reserve for the United States. A challenge within that is through extensive mapping, working with NOAA and Coast Guard, we have mapped our extended continental shelf beyond 200 miles, which is roughly the size of the state of California. It's called our extended continental shelf. Now, to legitimately file a claim for that, you also need to be party to the Law of the Sea Convention, which the United States is not, along with other great powers such as Libya. And so, there's a huge challenge. Are we going to get there in the next administration? I wouldn't hold my breath on that, in terms of what are some of the quick hitters that we could do as far as a path forward. But clearly that is at stake. We've heard the challenges of infrastructure up in the Arctic. I've been up there a number of times. And we were hopeful that when Shell had great ambitions to do drilling up there and then that collapsed, that they would bring the resources to bear to build a deep water port. And especially with the environmental challenges that they were having in the Pacific Northwest. They would probably much rather work with a more welcoming community when they're experiencing protest activity, not to mention the fact it's much closer to where they needed to be. The Army Corps of Engineers has done a number of studies. It distills down to Port Clarence, Kotzebue, and Nome, and that report is due out. But then you have a report. And then how does that get resourced? And then how do we move that ball forward? Fish stocks, as I alluded to earlier. The Bering Sea, very rich, fertile fishing grounds, and by all intents and purposes, it's a sustainable fishery. Very well managed. And we have a moratorium against fishing up in the Arctic. We also have a polar code for the Arctic as well. But do we have an enforcement mechanism in place to actually enforce fisheries in the high north? Do we have an enforcement mechanism in the high north to enforce the polar code? And the answer is no. So we have paper, but we haven't resourced. What is that tangible presence that's lacking in the Arctic? We have huge environmental challenges in the Arctic. As Shannon in his slide displayed, the amount of shipping activity that's up there. And my numbers may be outdated, David, correct me if I'm wrong, but roughly 5% of the Arctic is chartered to what we would call 21st century standards. And I don't know what happens when you get a 7.2 magnitude earthquake. Does that invalidate some of the soundings that were taken prior to? So this isn't just a one and done, and we can now with great reliability say we have charted the Arctic. Again, it is not a static environment. We have the shortcut in the Arctic as well. In 2017, Russia launched an ice-capable LNG carrier, the Christophe de Margerie. It's actually built in South Korea. The Yamal Peninsula is cranking out huge volumes of LNG right now. Russia has done their homework of how to produce and ship LNG out of the Yamal Peninsula going from the Eurasia across the Northern Sea Route to feed that market as well. Huge economic stimulus for Russia, so much so that in 2019, in the ice-free season, you don't need an ice-capable product carrier, an LNG carrier, to move Russia product. You say, well, that sounds awful risky. Well, not so much so, because Russia stood up a Northern Sea Route administration, and it's the Suez Canal North. It's not a free pass through the Northern Sea Route. We heard through Jeff Barker's presentation and others, we talk about freedom of navigation. We view the Northern Sea Route as an international strait, yet Russia treats that as internal waters, and you will have an ice captain, you'll have an icebreaker escort, and so we have some challenges there as well. When I was a Commandant, the National Security Council approached me and said, hey, we ought to send the Polar Star through the Northern Sea Route and do a freedom of navigation exercise. And I said, au contraire. It's a 40-year-old ship. We're cannibalizing parts off its sister ship just to keep this thing running. And I can't guarantee you that it won't have a catastrophic engineering casualty as it's doing a freedom of navigation exercise. And now I've got to call on Russia, to pull me out of harm's way. So this is not the time to do it. Ideally, it would be in the wake of what's just happened with Ukraine and the Black Sea, if we wanted to make a bold statement, but right now, we've got to keep our powder dry. And when it comes to resourcing, and this was we oversimplify, what does an investment in the Arctic look like? And certainly polar security cutters are a key component of that. But what resonates mostly on the Hill is the 20 to 1. roughly 20 Russian icebreakers to 1 U.S. And I flip it around the other way, and I said, well, what about 10 to 1? I said, what's 10 to 1? Our GDP is more than 10 times that of Russia, yet we're outnumbered 20 to 1 when it comes to exerting any meaningful presence in the Arctic domain. We'll see where that takes us. Hopefully we see an appropriation. Hopefully that's $750 million, but what's more important is we need to convey to industry with some degree of reliability. We haven't built one of these ships in over 40 years. This is a front-end investment that industry needs to make, but if they're seeing mixed signals, it's an investment they are not going to make. The ambassador from Finland was sitting next to me, and I'm sure Finland would love to build icebreakers. They build very capable icebreakers as well. But we've got to move beyond strategy, implementation, and then how do we resource that as well. As I alluded to earlier, the Arctic is really the bellwether for climate change. And certainly what happens in the Arctic does not stay in the Arctic. Fran Ulmer from the University of Fairbanks, many of you know Fran. I talked to her this past summer, and she had been up to the North Pole on a Russian ship, and it rained on the North Pole. Most people aren't aware of that. And when you have bitter cold Thanksgiving mornings here in Washington, D.C., well, one, that's weather, but two, a warming Arctic influences what happens in the lower latitudes. It influences the meandering of the jet stream, which brings in this new weather phenomenon called polar vortex. But the two are interrelated, and you can't look at one without looking at the other. The Baltic, they're seeing impacts to their environment. They're seeing red tides in the Baltic, decline in fish stocks. So again, a bellwether for change. It affects droughts. It affects wildfires. Mostly what we need to do is look at consequence management. If we deal with causality, I think we are going to fail coming out of the starting block, but we need to deal with the consequences of a changing climate and the patterns that are developing, and then how do we think long-term to prepare for a change in climate. Then finally, I will call it command and control of the Arctic. So we have Northern Command, NORAD, and I remember with one of the former NORTHCOM commanders, and I won't say which president, but said, so what do you do in the Arctic? And the response was, well, we track the whereabouts of Santa Claus on Christmas Eve. Well, it's a lot more than tracking Santa Claus. And if you ask EUCOM, they might have a different story. But if we're really going to have unity of effort, at least within the Pentagon, when it comes to the Arctic, we need to do a tech refresh, if you will, on the unified campaign plan. Ideally, one commander, one belly button that you could push. And also that same belly button, if you will, we have Joint Interagency Task Force. We have one at Southcom. We have another one at PACOM, GIATF West, at PACOM, Indo-PACOM, and we have GIATF South working for Southcom. I think the time has arrived where we look at a GIATF North, and certainly under the auspices of not just DOD, but this is really whole of government, domain awareness. I would suggest that a good place to start would be at NORTHCOM, where we already have a long-standing relationship with Canada. Our ally, our Arctic equities certainly resonate with Canada as well. But that might be a start going forward as well. So I'll leave it up to the next panel, and I'll open it up to some Q&A. But if we start looking at, what is a path forward for the Arctic? What are some near-term accomplishments that we can attain in the Arctic? For starters, we need to look at infrastructure. Let's pin down, where we need infrastructure. If we're going to be in the Arctic, the distances are too great, and we just can't get there from here. So let's begin with infrastructure. And part of that infrastructure is also our ability to communicate and move large bandwidths of data in the Arctic as well. So we need a champion for, this would most likely be space-based technology. There is fiber optic now coming up to the North Slope. But what does it take to operate in those high latitudes and provide real-term awareness? Domain awareness, and it's great. Coast Guard has got CubeSats for search and rescue, but we need to go a little bit further there. We need to revitalize the Arctic Executive Steering Committee. With the 116th Congress coming to town in January, I think that would be an easy start. It's a win-win. And if we can make this an apolitical issue, so we have continuity from one administration to the next, and I view it like building a ship. We're building a class of ships right now, and the program of record was 8. And we thought, okay, if we get 6, we'll be happy with 6. Well, we got 8. And in fact, the shipbuilders in the state where they were being built, they liked them so much that we're building 11, and we'll probably get a 12th. And so we need to do the same thing with the Arctic so that this is a sustainable, long-term view of the Arctic. And we don't do it in 2, 4, and 6-year increments, but it's a long-standing piece as well. And there's a number of veterans from the Arctic, and certainly those of you out in the audience as well. And nothing is probably more frustrating whether it's a Commandant of the Coast Guard or pick a public official and they move on to something else every 2, 4 years, and they have to do a refresh all over again. So this is really something that really needs to stand the test of time going forward. So I leave those thoughts with you for now. Stay tuned for the panel. Do stick around this afternoon because we really got some heavy hitters coming in as we look at some of the opportunities we see going forward to advance some of these thought pieces that I've put before you today.
Let's take a few minutes and let's have a couple of questions. Helen Brohl. See if it's on.
Transportation system. Thank you for your presentation. My question has to do with your interest in infrastructure in the Arctic. So the Committee on Marine Transportation did do a recommendation and an assessment of the maritime transportation system aspects of infrastructure needs in the U.S. Arctic. But on the defense side, are there things in particular that separate out from, let's say, what we would need for commercial maritime transportation needs? What are some pieces on the defense side of infrastructure that you think is needed in the Arctic?
Yeah. You really can't look at them separately when you start looking at whether it's commercial or military. And I say that, living in an island state. You know that there's a disturbance in the force as in the commercial sector when we've had the longshoremen go on strike. And going across the Poly Highway, you can't see the driver because the car is loaded with toilet paper. And so in Hawaii, you run out of toilet paper in 7 days. So it doesn't matter if you're military or civilian, you're out of toilet paper. But that same supply chain is also supporting our military component as well. So as I see a port, I see them as dual purpose ports. In Hawaii, there's a narrow spit of sand that separates the port of Honolulu from Pearl Harbor, but the two are clearly interdependent, if you will. So when I start looking at ports, I don't see these as a one purpose, but certainly a dual purpose. But the immediate need right now is for commercial, and that was driven home when we didn't get the fuel delivery into Nome. And at that point in time, we were able to call upon Russia to provide an ice-capable tanker escorted by the Coast Guard cutter Healy to resupply Nome. But I really see ports as these are clearly interrelated, commercially and military. But the greatest need right now is commercial.
Well, as you suggested, those were really interesting comments from the Admiral, and a unique perspective. When you're the former something, you have a little bit of distance from which to analyze.
Yeah.
So next up, speaking of people who have some perspective on this, David Sanger, a longtime reporter on national security issues for the New York Times, is a former Wilson Fellow, and he'll moderate a panel. Mike, tell us about the panel and who else we'll be hearing from.
So we'll have Admiral Zukunft once again. He'll give us that perspective from one step removed. Time allows him to speak perhaps a little differently. We'll also have Jim Townsend. He's a global fellow in the Polar Institute, but he also served as the former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Europe and NATO. And so that gives you that broader global perspective on the Arctic. Of course, Europe and NATO, very important components of the Arctic. And Sherry Goodman, who is a senior fellow of the Polar Institute. She's the former Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Environmental Security. So what we've asked David to do is have this roundtable discussion with these three very informed experts as this region evolves, NATO, Europe, the U.S., and the integration of all of the 8 Arctic nations.
And I don't want to brag too much, but the Wilson Center and Mike's program have been way ahead of the curve on this discussion of how environmental issues relate to security issues. And Sherry Goodman's a fantastic voice on the topic. Let's take a look.
I'll ask the panelists to come up here, and then I'll introduce them. Jim Townsend, thank you. I'll introduce you in a moment. Sherry Goodman, Admiral Zukunft, and David Sanger. Why don't you come up to the panel of chairs, and I'll introduce this. So it's a bit of a reunion as well, yes. This afternoon we thought we would do something a little different. So we called upon our good friend and colleague, David Sanger, and I literally called upon him and asked him if he would allow us to, infringe upon his day. David's on a robust book tour. If you have not read his book, you certainly should be reading his book. It is a fascinating read, The Perfect Weapon, War, Sabotage, and Fear in the Cyber Age. Not exactly uplifting, but as David will tell you, the tour is robust for a number of reasons. One is the intellectual capacity within the book, but also what it says about our times that we're currently living in. So David, as the New York Times national security correspondent, I want to thank you very much for taking the time away from your day. I also want to thank you as a colleague and friend, as a Woodrow Wilson Center scholar, where the completion of that book occurred. Thank you so much for allowing us to infringe upon you. David is joined by Sherry Goodman. Sherry is the Deputy Undersecretary of Defense and staff member on the Senate Armed Services Committee. That was her position before. She went on to many more things, but she's currently a senior fellow at the Polar Institute. And I infringed upon Sherry's time and asked her to join this panel as well. Sherry, thank you for being here. Admiral Zukunft, we've already introduced. But I will say that I thought your second presentation this afternoon really did set up not only this panel the rest of the day, but really tied together the themes that we saw earlier in the day. And then Jim Townsend. So Jim is a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Europe and NATO.
You know, since we've all been watching the funeral ceremonies for President George H.W. Bush, and tomorrow, and the lying in state last night and today, I was thinking as I was preparing for this that it's an interesting frame for the problem that we're facing today, and I wanted to start with Admiral Zumwalt, Admiral Zukunft on this. Admiral Zumwalt would also be interesting on this, but Admiral Zukunft would be really, really interesting on this. That's it. So for Admiral Zukunft, if you think about where we thought about this region when at the end of Bush 41's time, when we were still all off in a discussion of sharing the region, keeping it largely non-militarized. Obviously, there was some military activity around the edges of it. And where we are today, a little more than a quarter century after he left office, it's a very different place. And I was wondering if you would just start by telling us briefly how you think we got to this spot, and how you think if we came back here to have this panel again in, say, 5 years, how we're going to be looking at the Chinese, Russian, and American jockeying for position there 5 years from now.
I think we're, for the most part, a reactive nation, and not a lot of, I mean, we'll put some strategic forethought into our areas of emphasis, but more often than not, we're reactive. So what was the wake-up call to the Arctic? And even though not technically in the Arctic, it was the Exxon Valdez oil spill. The logistic challenges, number one, of how do we marshal a pollution response operation up in Alaska. So, wow, this is really hard. We didn't have Northern Command back then either. We had NORAD, but we didn't have Northern Command. So, so what was our outreach with the local community? We didn't have a national contingency plan to deal with oil spills Not only that, but the whole of government approach in putting what we call an area contingency plan together. Say you want to use maybe dispersants, which we did during the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. Well, you can't do that in Alaska, but we didn't even have the consulting mechanism in place to interact with the affected populace. So I would say that was probably our initial wake-up call of saying, wow, this is really hard. We never thought we would have another oil spill again. And then you have to fast forward to now Shell wants to drill in the Arctic. Just before the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, the White House under President Obama had lowered the bar, so to say, to offshore drilling. And they said, what are the likelihood that we would ever have another Exxon Valdez again? The answer is probably slim to none until Macondo 252 went up and the Deepwater Horizon, worst spill in U.S. history. On the heels of that, Shell is pumping $5 billion into drilling in the Arctic, doing all of the outreach and on the immediate heels of the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. And that really energized whole of government and says, whoa, hey, not so fast. And every time Shell would complete an environmental impact study, the goalpost would be moved further back as well. So I would say these were mostly reactive, and now we're looking at Russia. Wow, they've got a lot of icebreakers. Oh, and they're militarizing what used to be search and rescue stations. They're putting ice-breaking corvettes. And what's this? Now we have China, and now China's going to have 2 icebreakers, and they're knocking on our door. And what we call the 9-dash line, well, we have our extended continental shelf. And so, again, I call these predictive surprises, if you will. But each one of them has been reactive to what's happening around us. We're reacting to the retreat of sea ice that has now opened an ocean. But the ocean is opened in what I would call somewhat of a strategic void right now.
Well, before I turn to Sherry on that, you brought up the icebreakers. So just to level set us, we have 2 in service now, right? There's been discussion that we should have a fleet of 3 medium and 3 heavies. I don't think we're any place close to that, and Congress has maybe authorized 1 more. Do I have that right?
Yeah, so right now it looks like through the appropriation process, 1 through the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, and the DoD appropriation, it puts the Navy on the hook to fund 1. Under the DHS appropriation, there's a 2nd. We completed a high-latitude study. It's a 3-volume, it sits almost as high as this chair, study by an independent entity that says the United States needs 6. 3 heavy, 3 medium. GAO...
Russians have what about now?
46.
46. Yeah. Okay.
So we've done ample studies. I could build one out of paper mache with all of the paper that has been thrown at study.
You may have to.
And we go back to the Hill, and they say we want another study. And then we get our nose rubbed, and all you do is studies, and you're not building anything. Meanwhile, we've got industry waiting on the sidelines and saying, hey, we can build these in the United States, but we're not going to build in fiscal uncertainty and start something that's not going to be completed, lay off shipyard workers. And right now, we only have 5 what I would call Jones Act or deep water shipyards that can build commercial deep water ships. We don't have a lot of competitiveness in the United States. So this cuts across a number of areas. But yeah, we need to at least start building the first one. It's been 40 years since we laid up steel almost 4 inches thick to build a heavy icebreaker or a polar security cutter.
So, Sherry, take the same question on in the environmental security arena. Think of the era from the end of 41's time. Which was January 1993 and today.
Well, thank you, David, and thank you for being here. I think there's actually 2 complementary storylines from President Bush's presidency back 30 years ago. Actually, Admiral Z, in many ways, told the environmental story of the Exxon Valdez and the U.S. having to cope with an environmental disaster, not in the Arctic, but in Alaska, and coming to grips with addressing environmental requirements. At the same time, at the end of the Cold War, Cold War, I was on the Senate Armed Services Committee staff at the time. We were very robustly positioned in the Arctic. During the Cold War, we were prepared to defend the nation against a bolt-out-of-the-blue nuclear attack from the Russians. That's why we had the DEW line sites and many other infrastructure in the Arctic and including with Canada through NORAD. Then Cold War ends, and I led a program in the Department of Defense in the early 90s for the Secretary of Defense on Arctic military environmental cooperation. Just think about that name given the era we're in now. This is 25 years ago. Jim was involved with it. He was also in DOD. Arctic military environmental cooperation. This was a program of engaging the Russians with the Norwegians to help them deal with liquid waste streams from decommissioned Russian submarines that had sunk at the Murmansk harbor. And the Norwegians were deeply concerned that those sunken submarines might contaminate the fishing grounds in their region. So we spent about a decade working cooperatively with Russians and Norwegians. Many of the other Nordic nations and our other NATO allies were also involved to develop technology to offload the liquid waste streams and transport them inland to Chelyabinsk for proper storage. We also did bilateral military environmental cooperation projects with the Russians during that era. Now think about the era in which we're in today, where cooperation wouldn't be the name of a new program we'd give with the Russians today, certainly not in the Arctic. But I think we've heard some very interesting threads even this morning, connecting both the environmental security and the national security domains, in which is important, I think, for us to think through. Both of these are very relevant. Obviously, Arctic change is occurring because of environmental change so rapidly, and more rapid than anywhere else on the planet. At the same time, that's given rise to a new geopolitical dynamic and great power competition. We see China with the opportunity to create now the spider web of its polar Silk Road as it works its way across the Arctic, first for energy and perhaps in the future for fish. So I think we are really in a changed world. What I'd say is that we have to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. We got to be able to address our environmental considerations, our national security considerations, deploy a whole of government approach, and work in close cooperation with our allies.
So, Jim, if you take on both of those, but add into it, of course, you spent many years dealing with Europe and NATO on these issues, and after long therapy, you've come out of the...
And hair loss.
Yeah, right. That's right.
Well, yeah, thank you, and I appreciate the opportunity to be part of the lunchtime entertainment, so Mike, thank you very much. But you know, it's interesting, when the word came out that President Bush had passed away, I thought of the Arctic because in 1990, I started my work in Europe NATO as an action officer there, and I was doing Scandinavia. Dick Cheney was the SecDef, and my job was helping to lead the delegations to dismantle the DEW line, the dye sites in Greenland. I went up to Thule a number of times, North Warning, all those sites that were, as Sherry said, so important during the Cold War. I was in charge of closing those, negotiating with the Danes.
I cleaned them up.
And Sherry and I were working with cleaning those and other sites in Europe as the George H.W. Bush administration began that transition. And that's why it's so great that you started with President Bush, because he was this transitional president. I don't think he realized that. No one did when he was elected. But we started there in Europe on a trajectory through the 1990s where we began to shift out of the Cold War mode when it came to NATO and Europe and this type of thing into worrying about other things. And so what we saw, beginning with the dismantling of all those Cold War sites, was a disengagement by the U.S. from Europe and from a lot of what we were doing in the Arctic at the time, whether it was submarines or whatever it might be. We closed Keflavik, NAS Keflavik in Iceland in 1996, the spring of 1996. I was part of that. And so we began to imagine a Europe and a European Arctic different than what we had known during the Cold War. But what we were also seeing was the dismantlement of the muscle memory within the military on how to operate in the Arctic, whether it was ASW, whether it was submarine ops, whether it was all kinds of things that we were pretty good at in 1990. By the time we got into the 2000s, and we had other problems. We had post 9/11. We were in Afghanistan, Iraq, worried about foreign fighters. We were in sequestration, which really accelerated the movement of U.S. forces out of Europe and led to closure of facilities there. So it got us to a point, starting with George H.W. Bush, it got us to a point in 2014 that when the Russians came back, number one, and the Arctic was all of a sudden becoming a place very different than what it looked like in 1990 because of the ice was now melting. We found ourselves having to face an adversary in a part of the world where whatever muscle memory we had was pretty much gone in a lot of ways, and we were having to relearn a lot of things.
But their muscle memory wasn't gone, right? So, I mean, they talk a little bit about why it is that they kept operating. Well, obviously, we were distracted by Iraq and Afghanistan, but other things as well.
In China as well. Yeah. But it's interesting. Your point up there is interesting because not only in terms of the Russian muscle memory, in terms of operating the Northern Fleet, I'll just talk about that. I mean, they were beginning to repair a lot of the disarray that the Russian military had gone into post-Soviet Union days. And creating cruise missile capability and things like that. But I think to really point the finger of folks who did not lose their muscle memory, and that was the Norwegians. And I think anyone who's dealt with Norway in the past, whether it is ASW, P3 ops, dealing with the Arctic up there on the European side, that's one of the reasons we did Triton Juncture off of Norway, was that the Norwegians were concerned that they were the only ones in the alliance that knew how to fight up there. And the Norwegians have been saying that in NATO for years as we began to have out-of-area missions in Afghanistan and other places for NATO. They were saying, look, if the Russians ever come back, you know, we're the only ones who are watching them. And so when, in fact, we had the invasion of Crimea and, of course, Georgia before that, the Norwegians came in and said, okay, we got to pull up our socks here. And we all began to, once again, focus on the Arctic. And I think it was very interesting. Admiral Lewis talked at CSIS about the Second Fleet. And he was talking about that exercise and other exercises where the Navy is kind of clawing back its ability to work in the Arctic, at least in the European Arctic.
Sherry, when you were on the Armed Services Committee, nobody was discussing a Northern Sea route because nobody could have imagined you could have had one at the time. So tell us a little bit about how that's changed the politics of what's involved here.
Well, absolutely. And neither was anybody discussing environment when I was on the Senate Armed Services Committee. So we don't have to go back that far to see how far we've come from these days. I mean, we were not discussing operating at the surface in the Arctic back 30 years ago on the Senate Armed Services Committee with Senator Nunn and Senator Warner and others, but nor were we discussing it in the 90s in the Pentagon. What we've seen is a whole new ocean and a whole new region being created, within our lifetimes, within really the last decade. This has really all changed. The Russians, of course, have long been present in the Arctic. They have the longest Arctic coastline. Much of a significant portion of their GDP is tied to the Arctic. As Admiral Z noted earlier today, now they see the Northern Sea Route as essentially a toll road. The Suez Canal, where they can sort of enhance their GDP as China, South Korea, Japan, Singapore, and others perhaps transit that Northern Sea Route to get shorter access to those routes in Europe and to procure energy and other minerals. And so we're also seeing significant Chinese investment in Greenland and in Iceland. And I think it, along with the threat multiplier of climate change, making this a region changing more rapidly than elsewhere in the world, this is both unprecedented risk, but I think it's unprecedented opportunity, as we've heard from many of our speakers here this morning, that we can up our game in the Arctic. And I'm actually pleased to hear so many of our U.S. Government colleagues saying that they are really right there doing that.
So, Admiral Z, when we hear the military discussion going on these issues, it's almost always dominated by Russia. But over the longer term, strikes me we need to be far more concerned about the Chinese because they have the staying power in a way that the Russian economy is unlikely to give. They may not have as many icebreakers, but they've got a lot more economic interest in the route and a lot more ability, as Sherry has pointed out, to go co-opt certain areas that they can use as bases for this. I hear almost no discussion in the U.S. of the China strategy element of this. So can you walk us through a little bit? Maybe I'm just listening in the wrong places. Maybe in the Pentagon there is much more of a discussion of this.
Yeah, and I think if we're talking China, we have to look beyond the Arctic, and we also have to look at Antarctica as well, where China is growing its footprint there as well. The treaty for Antarctica will expire within the next 25 years or so, but explicit within that treaty is no resource extraction out of Antarctica. And the U.S. is the watchdog right now. Has there been any resource extraction? Not that we know of, but let's fast forward 25 years from now. As resources, especially rare earth metals, become more scarce, if you follow China, looks like they're cornering the market on that. There will be the OPEC of rare earth metals, hence the interest in Greenland. As that ice retreats, it now exposes soils to extraction as well. So China is clearly in the game, and in a non-transparent way, where we see them exerting influence, with Arctic nations, namely with Denmark via Greenland and with Iceland as well. They were one of the first to sign on to be observers to the Arctic Council. They are a near Arctic nation, which means they clearly have aspirations for the long term. Northern Sea Route, it cuts 4,500 miles of transit between the Asia and European market. Significant fuel cost savings, time savings, and a just-in-time inventory. And there are some models out there that say as early as 2030, there may be periods where the Arctic is completely ice-free. China is looking at all of those things, but they're doing something about it right now. They're making these investments. My speculation, looking at Russia and China both, is the United States is a sleeping dog right now. And as long as we're going to be a sleeping dog, then let's get ourselves ahead of the game. And let's put the United States in a position where they have to catch up, much like we did when Sputnik went into outer space. So if I were to view how China and Russia view us, I would say they view us as a sleeping dog, and let's take full advantage of this opportunity that we have created for them.
We have about 10 or 15 minutes left for additional, so we want to make sure to get some of your questions in. I want to start with Mike, since he brought us all here today. And
I get to ask a question.
And
Okay.
you've got the microphone, so it's even better.
Okay. Well, I didn't expect a question, but sure, I'll take one. And we've got about 5 to 7 minutes or so. So I do want to get some questions here.
We'll do quick questions.
We'll do quick.
And quick answers.
So here's my quick question. We've talked about many countries today, but Admiral Zukunft, you have highlighted the relationship with Canada through NORAD and other things. So I wonder if you would talk about going forward the relationship between the United States and Canada and how that figures into Jim, your comments, Admiral Z, your comments, and Sherry, your comments, because that is a strategic alliance that we depend on in so many different ways. Perspectives?
I'll take that first. So just over a year ago, we sent a ship from Alaska to Baltimore via the Northwest Passage. Now, we just didn't do it unilaterally. We informed Canada that we were going to do so, and Canada said, well, you're going to need an escort and you're going to need an ice captain, so you cannot do what they thought was a freedom of navigation operation, not an exercise, through the Northwest Passage. So we talk about the Northern Sea Route, but we also have this same rub point, if you will, with Canada and the Northwest Passage. There may be an opportunity where bilaterally, at least U.S. to Canada, we can broker a freedom of navigation clause, if you will, especially for U.S. public vessels, military vessels, as we did with the Panama Canal, where we don't need permission to go through there. But I think that might be a start going forward. But even, as I sit here today, we embark Canadian scientists on our icebreaker to do this very same mapping of the extended continental shelf. We have areas that overlap that Canada says this is ours, and we say no, it is ours. So we have a couple of rub points there as well in terms of some of our extraterritorial claims with Canada. But before we try to broker this with Russia, let's do it with an ally. Let's do it with a neighbor first, and establish that precedent. So I think there is an opportunity in this long enduring relationship that we have with Canada.
Quick one from Jim.
A real quick one. I've worked Canada for many years as well, and we have no greater ally than Canada in so many ways that isn't really seen publicly. But in terms of certainly on the defense side, we're very, very tight. And NORAD, of course, is the centerpiece of that, but it's more than just NORAD. And I think what we ought to think about into the future is that we talk about North Warning, and I'm not sure what the status of North Warning is today, but when I was working North Warning a few years ago, more than a few years ago, it was in bad shape. And to fix up North Warning, which of course is that first line of radar sites to catch something coming over the pole, to work up there and to do the technology up there is a lot of money. And so there's that. Also, there's air bases that if you're going to catch something coming over the pole, you need interceptors to go up, and that's usually the Canadians. So it's quite a web of air defense that we have with Canada that now, just like what I was talking about earlier, we find ourselves having to do things with Canada that we thought were over with in 1990, and they're not over with. We're in a new place with this a new kind of threat. There's a new technology out there, but the old relationship is there with Canada, thank God. But we have to know, too, that in terms of the Arctic and working with them and things that are Alaskan, we've got that whole northern area, too, that's in terms of the military and defense relationship that's also on our plate and will be calling for a lot of money and resources in the future.
Sherry, you have something you wanted to...
Well, I agree completely. Canada is, of course, a vital ally to the U.S. overall and also operating in the Arctic. And when you look at the map, as we saw many times earlier today, we actually have a North American Arctic in terms of geography, which does include Greenland. And we should be very mindful that when we think about sort of our alliances in the Arctic as Greenland gains ever more sovereignty from Denmark and has ever more Chinese foreign direct investment and potentially influence in the region, we need to embrace Greenland and ensure that it is part of our conception of the North American Arctic.
You have a question right over there. Hold on just a sec. Somebody's going to bring you a mic.
Thanks for taking my question. I'm Azita Raji, former U.S. ambassador to Sweden. Admiral, you talked about implementation, and I'd like to ask all of you, who is talking about implementation of all the strategy briefings that go on, of everyone who's interested? Who is thinking about how to get things done? And if no one is doing that, who are the people that we should all be thinking about talking to? Is it the business community? Often incentives are the best way to motivate people to get something done. Is it the grassroots? Do we have some sort of a campaign plan to get people's attention? There are a lot of issues, and how can this become the a conversation that people have around their dinner table when they're worried about things, in addition to healthcare and education for their children? How do we elevate this issue? So I'm interested in, okay, this is all great and very interesting and intellectually stimulating, and there's great strategy. What is the strategy for implementation, and how do we talk more about that?
Yeah, so I think we really need to break this down into consumable bite-sized pieces. And so we'll start with a polar security cutter. And in this town, we often simplify. So what does it mean to exert influence in the Arctic? All you need are icebreakers. Russia has 46, we have 2. Okay, so we'll get icebreakers. Well, it's not that easy. How do you get that into the budget? So we've got part of that in the Navy budget. In fact, we've stood up a joint program office, Navy and Coast Guard, that will look at the requirements for a polar security cutter. And oh, by the way, One of those will reserve space, weight, and power if we have to fully arm this with an offensive and a defensive military capability. Unlike the two ships that we have right now, one is basically a scientific platform, and the other is just a big bulldozer that breaks ice. And so we're having those discussions right now. More importantly, we're working with our authorizers, and more importantly, the appropriators. We'll see what happens with the 116th Congress. We'll have a new chairmanship of the House Appropriations Committee. So all the legwork, and I spent, I think, 100 congressional dinners in my quarters when I was the Commandant of the Coast Guard, convincing members of Congress, both sides of the aisle, authorizers, appropriators, of why we, the United States, need to invest in these platforms.
I think we have time for just one more, if, ma'am.
Hi, I'm a scientist, and I'm also an Alaskan. And one of the things that I've noticed when I'm not staring at equations, because that's what I like to do, but when I'm not doing that, is I think we have an attention span problem in the United States in terms of the national security. So when we talk about the Chinese and the Russians, the Chinese, they have 10, 100-year attention span on presence in the Arctic. Ours lasts about 4 years, sometimes less. So I want to kind of hear what you think strategically, how we can, if we're going to get funding, we need to extend our attention span. So how does that work?
So, Nettie, thank you for that question. And I think you and I have been talking about this for a while, and you and many of the Alaskans and others in this room do take the long view because you're an Alaskan or you live in the region or you've devoted your careers to working on these issues. And we often observe that the Chinese do take the long view in the Arctic and elsewhere. I must say I was very heartened today to hear from our Navy colleague that the new Navy strategy takes a long-term view of presence. Now, okay, we know we've had subsurface presence. That's a long-term view, but I understood that comment to be a long-term view about a whole of Arctic strategy for the Navy, and I think that applies also in the words I think we also heard from the Air Force that you know, it's long been a strategic buffer, but now it's porous. And when porous meaning like open to other threats, and therefore we have to be able to defend against them. So I think that we are moving into a time when there's going to be greater consideration. And I think just as gathering here today, I mean, when I look at the array, and this goes back to the ambassador's question here, you know, the array of both private sector and public sector involvement here today, and thank you to all those private sector sponsors that have made this possible. You know, you're also looking to sort of innovation and the next sort of economic opportunity in the region. And I think with the work that Mike and others are doing here at Wilson, we hope to be, you know, the opportunity to keep that sustained on the forefront of policymakers' mind in this administration and with the new Congress.
Well, I thank you for a great conversation. Thank all three of you for pushing us along here. And Mike, you want to tell us where we're headed next?
Sure, but let me thank ASRC Federal again for providing this venue for us. Extraordinary venue. Thank you again. My thanks to Jim Townsend, Paul Zukunft, Sherry Goodman, and David Sanger. You cannot get a better panel on these subjects than the four of you. Thank you very, very much.
Okay, Mike, your thoughts?
Well, I think that you can see the urgency and the passion by that panel. There's an urgency because things are changing so quickly. The experts here are passionate about making sure the United States is positioned well for the changes, and the depth of expertise there teased out by David, his perspective, but also the perspectives from the other former undersecretaries, assistant secretaries of defense. It gives you insight into how things work and how things are planned for.
Thanks, Mike. And our series will continue thanks to the good folks at GCI for making this possible and bringing it to you, and I hope you're finding it useful as well. So please join us again for another part in the series. Until then, for Mike Sfraga and all of us at the Wilson Center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for watching.